of Sex and the Old Woman, looking at boundaries. But as we said in the blurb, this will not just be around intimate sexual relationships, but we'll be looking at boundaries in general. You know, how do we hold our boundaries? Do we compromise our boundaries? You know, looking back on our life, where were we able to hold them? And when were we able to say yes, and when were we able to say no? So
yeah, and to add to that, the boundaries and consent, I think, are foundation for so much. And very often, I don't think we've not had great schooling. So we'll also look at our childhood and, you know, where did we pick up things that we, where we got taught not to hold our boundaries very well. So we come back to that. But as Gwen said, this isn't just in an intimate setting, but also it could, you know, very often we're not very good in intimate setting as well, but this is also a general conversation around boundaries. So I think, because we've got a new person on the panel today, welcome Sally. Let's start with Sally, and maybe first introduce yourself a little bit, and maybe if you want to start sort of just saying a little bit about maybe your experience around boundaries and just a little bit about yourself.
Oh, nothing like putting me in the hot seat.
I know. Sorry.
Do you want to put a boundary in, Sally?
Yeah, very good idea.
Well, I'm 71 years old. I've got 3 daughters who are in their early 40s and late 30s, and 5 grandchildren. And I've been a physiotherapist for 45 years. So in that context, I've learned very good professional boundaries and, you know, things about keeping people's confidences and things like that's really, really important. I now work one-to-one with people, basically using thought pattern management, neuro-linguistic programming for change. And so a lot of people bring a lot of stuff to me that is quite intense and sometimes has been very distressing. And so, yeah, it's really, really important for me to have boundaries and for them to understand that they have boundaries with me in the session and outside. So I always start my sessions by saying nothing goes out of this room. And if you feel uncomfortable with the question I ask, because I've asked the question, your unconscious mind will give you the answer anyway. I don't have to hear it. So you just, you know, and I teach them how to say, I'm not going to answer that, or I don't feel comfortable. So that feels really good. As a young person, I didn't have very many boundaries, I don't think. I'm not sure I ever, well, I must have needed them. Certainly was never talked about. And not something that was in my awareness in any way at all. You just did what you were told, basically.
Thank you, Sally. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted with sorting out some technical stuff. So Sunday or Gwen, do you want to add something about your own experience with boundaries?
Can I just ask you before you do go on, because we're both watching Messenger, because Steffi's communicating with us, and what she's saying is she can't see it going live.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at the moment.
So just so that everybody on the panel is aware of that, can you sort that, Melanie, from your
Yes, I'm doing that now.
Brilliant. Okay, sorry, but that just felt important to have that boundary in place. Okay, Sunday, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, thank you, Sally, for kicking us off there. Yeah, I too didn't have boundaries modelled, and I'll introduce myself before I go straight into the context of the call. My name's Sunday. I'm a relationships coach, and I specialise in estrangement, where adult children have chosen to exit out of their parents' lives for a variety of reasons. And Yeah, so boundaries is wrapped up in my work in as much that very often as parents we let our boundaries down and don't actually maintain them. My no wasn't very good, although I have to say it's got better. And I find myself in this interesting place in this call, in that I know that I have breached people's boundaries. And recently I nearly did with you when we were in the coffee shop the other day. So I'd like to share about that. But so I was very much into boundary breaking. I saw no as a challenge. And I witnessed other family members seeing no as a challenge. So I can bring that other side of being the boundary breaker, but also the boundary maker, you know, realizing that I had to step into my personal power and put some limits in place, because there was, in my family of origin, there was no boundaries. There was no there was very, very little perception of anybody's no being heard, and just constantly our boundaries as children, which I think is very often the case, being broken without even anybody even realizing they were breaking boundaries, you know. And I just wanted to tell a little tale which would start us off, or start me off really quite well, in as much that there's a push now in amongst the sort of the boundary making world, where we are recognizing that to make our children kiss and hug, or be kissed and hugged by family members that they actually actively shrink away from. I had an experience of that. Somebody was, I asked a little girl that I didn't know, but I'd been chatting with the family, and they said, are you going to wave bye-bye to me? And she did a very clear no. And of course, the parents then are all embarrassed, you know, like, wave to the kind lady. And I stepped in and said, actually, do you know what? I'm really glad she said no. You know, I'm really, somebody, a little girl who knows that she doesn't want to do something is a delight to be around. And I think I quite shocked the family, but they were really pushing for this little girl to, I suppose, have some appreciation that I'd been chatting with her and being friendly with her. And she was a very clear no. And it was a great reminder that actually we do know, you know, we do know about the no. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sunday.
I'm curious about what happened in the tea shop.
Do you want me to tell you now? Okay, so I was, the Sunday that is full of excitement, love and happiness just wants to bestow it on other people, whether they want it or not. So whilst I was at the counter and I saw you, and I think you were on your own, I don't quite know, but I just all of a sudden got this impulse to rush over to you, plant a kiss on your cheek, give you a big hug and say, I love you. And I stopped myself.
And did you stop yourself because you thought you were stepping over a boundary, or what?
Yeah, so there's something about asking for permission, which I'm very slow to the party with that. And also for me, it sometimes takes away that spontaneity and that surprise factor, which, you know, for me to ask permission, this is really interesting because I've probably not articulated this before. For me to ask permission if I can do something seems to sort of take away from some sort of spontaneity that I feel in that moment of expression. And it comes, then it feels a bit diluted and a bit less than, because you're really getting my full wattage. And some people don't like my full wattage. I've realized that now. They'll tolerate it, a lot of them, out of politeness, and hold something, you know, that isn't right for them. So I find it both sad, but I also realize, probably more so in this day and age than ever, that it isn't appropriate to go around hugging people randomly, much as I sometimes would love to.
I think that's a really interesting one though, Sunday, because I'm practicing something that sort of is related to that. Because I think I hold myself back because I feel too much, like I want to give too much, like hugs and love and stuff like that. but what I've been noticing about myself is that I can hold people back because of a fear of not being accepted in that. So yeah, and this spontaneity thing, I think, is one of the things that I think is an interesting one, because I've been finding that asking people then gives me the permission to be completely myself with someone. So I've been finding that that's been a real learning edge for me in terms of being able to be completely, fully my self-expression. But it's beautiful. We're all doing this.
What I was feeling was there's like a boundary within a boundary here.
Mm.
I would have loved to have received that hug and kiss.
Next time then, next time.
So I'm actually giving you permission now, but I'm sad that you didn't do it. But I actually, if you'd asked me for permission in the cafe, it would have given me too much time to think. I would have enjoyed the spontaneity. But when I say boundary within a boundary, I feel that you and I have established a boundary of some sort, somewhat unspoken, but through the evolving of our friendship. Whereas I recently was at a training event, and this came up in the first morning, and because it was a lot about grief, the discussion was around the boundary of hugging. Was it okay to hug people, or did people want to give their permission? Because we didn't know each other. We'd never met before, any of us. So that felt appropriate, because sometimes people go into rescue with a hug, don't they?
Yeah.
It's really, the boundary is about maintaining, holding the boundary and holding the space to allow somebody to express themselves without overstepping the boundary and rescuing them, which I think is very different. And that's kind of what I mean about a boundary within a boundary. So that brings up the question of how many boundaries are there? What are boundaries, and when do we really need to have them in place?
Because I was just going to say, have you ever had an experience where you've rushed up to somebody and they've actually taken a step back and said, hands off?
Yeah.
Which, creates their boundary. But I can imagine that could be quite uncomfortable.
I think that's what I was pointing to with a fear, because once that happens, I hold back from doing it again with anyone else.
Yeah.
Whereas I've had the other experience of working in a prison and reaching out and touching somebody, and he went berserk, absolutely berserk. Don't ever touch me like that. Don't you ever. And for the first time in my 30-year career, I felt I'd overstepped a boundary. And that, it was quite profound, because if he had reported me, that could have been interpreted very differently. So yeah, I've had that experience of somebody, not only, but it was so sad to witness, because I could see the fear, the confusion, and it made me question about how he had been touched in the past, what touch meant to him. And I hadn't even considered that, because my experience was that a lot of these young men appreciated a touch, but this young man had a very, very different story. And I obviously had completely intruded and overstepped that boundary. And it was really distressing for me as well, that I could have done that to somebody.
Gwen, you asked what is a boundary, and it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I can imagine we've all got a different descriptor for it. And I think for me, a boundary is something that I've learned that it's about looking after me. And I know that in the world that I work in, boundaries can be used as sort of like weapons in a way. This sort of like, it's really, for me, when something seems nonsensical, everybody has a right to boundaries, and sometimes there seems to be some that are used as sort of get out of my face type thing, you know, used as in a way, like I say, as a weapon, especially in the work that I do. I don't know if I can give you an example of that, where it often comes with labeling and sort of disagreements in relationships between two people or more people, and it can create an exclusion. That's I think what I'm trying to say. Boundaries can be very excluding, and if there's no sort of rationale around it, you know, or you can't say this particular word to me, and we're, you know, like we're moving into the transgender agenda here, you know, it's like those boundaries of you've got to speak to me like this, or you can't say that. And is that a boundary? I don't know. For me, a boundary is me taking care of myself, you know. And again, I was late to the party around all of this, and the first time I heard myself, well, something in me said, I don't like the way you treat me. And that was a boundary that possibly was like 40 years in the making, in the creating, in the birthing of. And when I stated that, all my cells in my body didn't know whether to laugh, dance, cry, sing. It was like an electric shock. And hearing myself say that was one of the most significant things, sounds a bit dramatic to say this, of my life, really, because I was saying it to somebody who had been a pest for all of my life, not just part of it, all of it. And it was the start of actually our journey, my experience of my relationship journey with this person to health and wholeness, where we are almost there with it. So it was massive. And you know, and so for me, a boundary is something to look after myself. It's something that I struggle to implement still, because I'm so open, and although I like openness, and so it can be hard for me to put something in place, and also hard to restrain myself from not stepping over other people's boundaries. And yeah, and being that little imp that I sometimes can be when I think their boundaries bloody silly, and I'm I'll shush now before I incriminate myself further.
It really comes back to that thing that we all live in our own map of the world. And you know, if I had learned that when I was 5 or 6, that your map is not my map, and that I can respect your map, and we have areas where we cross over, but there are areas that are mine alone. You know, just teaching children that sense of self-respect and respect for other people's maps is huge.
Yeah, it is. And I just think, Sunday, you say you were cut late to the party. I certainly feel that as well. I think, I don't know whether it's a generational thing, but I certainly grew up not knowing I could have boundaries. Like my parents, particularly my mum, was quite controlling and would say, you can watch telly or you can't watch telly. You're not allowed sweets, or you're not allowed to do this, or, you know, you're not allowed friends unless I've met their parents, and, you know, you're not allowed to have a boyfriend, you're not allowed to come home late. All these sorts of stuff, I think, condition us to feel that we don't have agency over ourselves. And I think there is a shift in that. I mean, we saw this lovely video earlier, you know, with a girl being taught how to hold her boundaries and to say no. And I think that's beautiful that it is much more known now. But I certainly went into my teens a bit screwed up, and my teens and 20s a bit screwed up around boundaries, and let men do what they want, and accepted bosses who told me I had to work late and I was crap at my job, and bully me, and all this sort of stuff that actually, looking back, was because I didn't have a sense of who I was, because that control had been taken away from a very young age. And having to relearn that now. And I think, coming back to your question around boundaries, Gwen, for me, it's a body thing. I certainly, having done a lot of work on listening to my body now, it's in my body. I'll know if I'm excited about something or I'm a no to something. I can feel it in my body. I also can feel it in my head sometimes when someone's overridden my boundary, that I can be ranting at them in my head. And this is another thing about boundaries, is that I found very often I could be ranting at someone in my head, but not tell them about it, or not share that, or not talk about that boundary that was overridden. So I think that's an interesting one. Has anyone else had those sorts of experiences?
I certainly have, and I think that so much of it is having the words, having the language. And so again, that's part of, as a grandparent, is teaching youngsters, young people, because if it becomes inimical to them, if it's completely embedded for them, then it feels normal and natural. It's not something that they have to work at.
I loved how you described just what you said about this is my map and your map is different. And the fact is, I can have my own map. And I was thinking, when I was young as in that age that you referred to, 5, whatever it was, I had a sense of boundaries. I think we come in with a sense of boundaries. And what happens is we learn to compromise them. And that's the sad thing. But what also is teaching the children is to listen to each other when they're expressing what their map is. And that's the thing that adults are not great at. Listening to when a child is stating a boundary. We have to also respect it and hear it, and maybe be uncomfortable with it. And therefore, what also comes to mind is how somebody who stands very clearly in their boundary, how disconcerting that can be as the mirror image. And especially children, they, like you said earlier, Melanie, oh no, it was you, Sunday, about the child that had to wave bye-bye. All those times we've been told to do things, which meant our boundaries were dishonored. And I mean, the thing in my household was, no matter what my mum did, and she was quite difficult and challenging at times, we always apologized. I would be indignant because I would feel wronged that this was not my fault. This had nothing to do with my truth or my experience, but no matter what, I had to apologize. And I don't remember my mother apologizing ever for her behavior. And that's quite a damaging experience. And I'm sure, many of us have had, if not the same, but similar experiences of being told to do things when we didn't think it was right. And it was completely upsetting to our boundaries.
I had a very similar experience as well with my mum, who never apologized, even when it was found to be completely her fault. It wasn't. She would never apologize. And it just got me thinking, actually, this is also, we haven't talked about this, but this is also for me about responsibility. so we learn a lot from our parents, just watching our parents. And part of, for me, boundaries setting and honoring boundaries is actually being able to take responsibility for where we have or haven't
Yes.
honored boundaries, or where we haven't honored someone else's boundary. And I think that also can get really screwed up when parents don't honor that and be responsible for that. And this isn't a bashing of parents. I think we've all probably done it in some respects, but I think for me, that was certainly the way I grew up, is having parents that weren't responsible for, for what they did or didn't do.
Yeah, it's a hard one, is that? Because there's something about, we were modelled that parents, our generation, I don't know if you were different, but I was modelled that my parents, knew it all, had it all. They were on a bit of a pedestal, that they were like God. To see their fallibility is quite, when some children obviously do have parents who aren't in their power, whether it be personal power or power over as a sort of family lead. And that must be quite unsettling, because there's something about having stable, we know it all, we've got it all handled parents, that somehow gives a really sort of grounded childhood for those first few years anyway, because there's no sort of like wobbliness. But then they do slip off the pedestal, and you begin to question, and you think, what's going on here? And yet they're still on this pedestal. And I think it's like the blind leading the blind, isn't it?
It is.
To be honest. Yeah.
It is. And I've done a lot of work
from
around
their childhood, and then it just sort of rolls on down the generation. But I think it is changing. I think there is this more awareness now. I mean, there's more material for a start off around boundaries and stuff. Yeah, but I wanted to mention about resentment, because I love resentment, in as much that it's such a wonderful indicator that I'm not honouring my own boundary. It's like, oh yeah, here I am feeling resentful, so I'm doing something. And aren't we as women trained out of that? Really, we are trained into doing something that we don't want to do, basically. Like, it's, so I'll just get this done, and I don't really want to do it, but I'll do it anyway, and then I'll do something else. And I think resentment is such a wonderful tool to realise that something's not happy in the body, something's not happy, and something needs to be said. And then that's the next problem, isn't it? Saying it.
Yeah, it's the saying it that I pointed to earlier, but it brings me on to a question I wanted to ask anyway, which is around yeses and nos. And maybe going back to sharing from our own experiences, what do you have particular issues with one or the other? Do you find it easy to say yes and not no, or vice versa? I'm interested in hearing more about that.
I've certainly many times said yes when I meant no. And actually, I'm much, much better now at taking a pause and even saying I don't know, or give me some time to think about it, or something like that. And I spend a lot of time teaching my patients, clients, to stand in front of the mirror and look at themselves and say, no. To practice it, because they don't do it. Says my internet.
Could you just repeat what you said, because we missed it?
We lost you for a minute.
I've spent many a time with a patient or a client teaching them to stand in front of a mirror and say no. Because if you're not used to it, if you don't feel comfortable doing it, you're not going to be able to do it in front of someone who is stepping on your toes, unless you can do it for yourself.
Yeah, no, definitely. I teach the wheel of consent, and so we do a lot of that work as well. So that's really, really powerful stuff, doing it in the mirror. Gwen, Sunday?
I was just going to say to Sally, that's quite a good tip as well. If you're stuck between yes and no, just saying, I don't know. That feels like a good thing. You know, that feels like another option. So thanks for that. In fact, what happened was the other day, Melanie and I had a call together, didn't we? Where
We did.
we just had a little chat about what we were going to talk about today. And I made notes and she said, do you want to write this up or shall I? I can't tell you how I dithered in the answer because I didn't want to do it, but I had the notes and I didn't want to impose on Melanie. But for goodness sake, she asked, do you want me to do it? And honestly, could not. And in the end, I think you said, I'll just do it. I was like so relieved. And how simple was that? So, you know, I do still, and I will say when it comes to work, I have less trouble with boundaries. When it comes to intimate relationships, I really struggle in that area, asking for what I want or saying no. I don't want to be intimate just now, or I don't enjoy that, or whatever it might be. That's when I know I am really having trouble with my boundaries. And that's an area that I would really like to improve upon.
Yeah, I think, and we were going to,
Yeah, isn't
sorry?
it? That's about your self-worth. That's
It
about,
is about your self-worth, but also I think the whole, and we can come on to this in a minute, I know we weren't going to focus on intimate, but I think this is it can get really tricky in intimate relationships because there's so much going on. There's the relationship with that person and not wanting to upset them. There's also sexual patterns and heightened sexual, feelings and arousal and all that sort of stuff. So it can be a whole minefield in intimate relationships, actually, which we can come back to in a minute, unless Sunday wants to say something about it. Because
I think we should come back to it. Could. I think it would be interesting. It's not about focusing on it, but you know, just taking the conversation, developing it. It is an area where I think people feel incredibly sensitive when it comes to.
Yeah.
Say, like in work, I really didn't have that same problem establishing boundaries. It was very important in my work, but like what Sally was saying. But even though I was good at setting boundaries there, I was not good at setting boundaries elsewhere. And I think that was a lot to do with culture, conditioning, expectation around being a woman. So I would like us to open that box up a little bit and
I can certainly kick us off into that realm with something about my body, my own. I just wrote that down here, my body, my own. So yeah, as a child, my body was just somebody else's to use in terms of work and stuff like that. So, but I remember that, and this was quite a significant thing that came to me as a memory, that there was a man at the gym and we were a bunch of women and who used to coffee and sit around and chat before we do our workout and stuff. And this guy had taken it on himself to have free access to anybody for hugs. And not one of us, we all hated it. And not one of us was brave enough to say no to this man. He would come at you with a big grin and big arms. And he wore this aftershave that somehow all of us ended up, well, I don't know whether all of us, but it was on me for the rest of the day. And that was the main thing that I didn't like, that I just smelt of this man all day. And I found that really difficult. And even and we used to gossip about him. And I thought how unkind it is that nobody's actually telling him that he's off limits, that he has to stop. I think eventually somebody complained to management and he got a flea in his ear from management. But that was something that, you know, that I didn't have the confidence at that point. Men seem to have power, have the right to access my body, either looking at it, you know, like, I mean, now I love it. If anybody whistled at me, I'd love it. But in the olden days, it was like, please don't, you know, don't don't show me that. I don't want you looking at my body in that sort of way. And I'm a bit mixed up about that, because there is something about men's appreciation. They're either doomed if they don't look, and also doomed if they do. You know, it's, why aren't you looking at me? And then don't, you know, I think we're also mixed up about that. And but yeah, that's sort of my take on men and boundaries with men and intimacy.
And this brings me on nicely to a conversation that I wanted to bring in anyway, which is who giving and receiving, and who's it for? Because I think there's an interesting one here around, very often I've had situations like that where someone will come up to me and offer me a hug. Like, oh, can I give you a hug? But actually it feels really weird and horrible. And when I started doing a lot of will of consent work, what they look at is, who is it for? Because when we often say, I will give you something, actually what it's supposed to be is for you. But very often the person giving something will actually be doing it for them, which will often be why it feels slimy and people don't want to do it. And I think this is also an interesting nuance around boundaries and consent, because we don't actually talk about, and we don't discuss, who is it for? And there is a difference. And sometimes you can be willing to give something for someone else, but don't really want to do it, if that makes sense. Like, I talk about it as, oh my God, don't do something unless you're, oh my God, yes, to something. But you could also be willing to do something for someone else because you want to, you know, they're asking you and you're willing to do it. So there's all these sorts of nuances when you talk about boundaries as well, that again, we don't talk about, because it is quite a minefield, but it is also, not talking about it is why we're so screwed up about it.
So what would you say, Mel, if someone came up to you who you really did not want to be hugged by, and they came up and said, let me give you a hug, or can I give you a hug? What would you say or do?
I would say no, thank you.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast the other day, and on this podcast she was talking about consent, and she was talking about the unapologetic no.
Yeah.
You know, again, this comes back to consent, where we think we have to justify a no because we're concerned about, are we going to hurt the other person, upset the other person? Or we don't say no, we say yes because we don't want to hurt the other person.
I've had a go on Facebook with some of these men who say friends, who want to be friends, and I'll message them. And or they'll message me and I'll say, no, thank you, please leave me alone. My God, am I facing myself when these people don't honour my boundary, don't honour my no, you know. And that's another thing I want. I'm sort of amazed that there's this sort of vibrational frequency thing again, which is we attract in the lessons to make us sort of like step into being sure that we've got this boundary. So people will occasionally pop up in my life who won't listen to my no, and I have to assert myself. And I think it's great because it keeps me on my toes. It keeps my boundaries sort of like having to be looked at, refreshed and everything. And I'd be amazed if you go through life and not have to have these types of people popping up who push for what they want. And don't take the first no as a no, you know, and I've had a lot of that. And that's obviously a mirror of me, because I've obviously pushed for my wants over somebody else's no. I don't know where I was going with this, but it it feels important to say that for me, that I recognise that the practice of saying no's at arm's length on Facebook has really certainly helped me in my everyday life out here. And it's ironic today that I was out for an hour's walk, and I was on sort of what I would call a nature walk. And I was approached by two lovely men, one of whom offered to take a photograph of me with a tree because I think he thought I was taking a selfie. And so without any, you know, I handed him my iPad, he took a photograph, we had a sweet moment. But then this other guy was really lovely, and I ended up touching him, and going back in my memory, you know, I touched his arm, I shook his hand, we spent quite a bit, about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour. I was taking a photograph of him as he was setting off on this walk, and I was thinking about it, you know, like the level of trust in me to do that. I mean, there were people around, so it didn't feel at all threatening. But I wonder sometimes if we put boundaries in place when we don't actually need them, and they actually cause some sort of disconnect between what could be. Because this guy said, it's so unusual for somebody to talk to me. Thank you. You know, like people don't talk to each other anymore. And I suppose it's because we're maintaining our boundaries, because we've been fed a lot of, I would say B, but I won't, a lot of stuff that increases our fear. Then we think we've got to have boundaries, when actually perhaps we don't need them so much as we think we do, because fear is like a wall, not a boundary. And I think some boundaries are created through fear rather than through consideration.
I think that's a lovely way to put it, Sunday, because I think for me, there's two distinct set of boundaries, what you're talking about there. I think nowadays, since I've done a lot of work on boundaries, I wouldn't consider that first part, that fear-based boundary, to be an authentic boundary. And I love the word authentic, because I think for me, authentic means, are we true to ourselves? Are we in our bodies? Are we coming from our hearts? Are we saying what we want? You know, all the things we've just been talking about. But if we're keeping people at arm's length from fear, is that a true boundary? For me, that I'm not sure that is.
And I think that's where I was alluding to at the beginning, with a lot of these adult child parent stuff that goes on, that lots of that, those sort of boundaries, as they're called, are made through fear. And I think then that blocks down the communication, the healing communication that's needed. You know, a lot of this go no contact, you know, there's a movement out there now for people to actually, you know, a grey rock is another thing, you know, you don't speak to people. But so it's boundaries, it's not a blocking communication is the only thing that we're going to get through. So when you put a boundary in that's sort of like no contact or grey rock or stonewalling or whatever you want to call it, that isn't a boundary in mine. That's a wall. And that's with F off written on it, you know. And that just actually alienates people even more, and the connectiveness between us all.
I want to also bring us on to another question, which is around consent and boundaries as an older woman. I certainly know from some of the research I've been doing around post-menopause, very often as we go through menopause, it turns out that we start to question a lot, you know, are things, we're less likely to put up with things that we don't want, we're more likely to voice things, we potentially have a, you know, experience and a wiser understanding of what we do and don't want. And so I'm just interested in your thoughts around that.
My recognition of older women is that, and I'm talking about older women, generation before me, and I'm going on my mum really, is that they lose their voice, they lose their boundaries again. And people start to say, I remember once we were out and somebody asked my sister, does she want tea? You know, that classic thing. I don't think it was tea and a sugar, but it was something like that. And my sister was absolutely enraged and said, ask her yourself. She was really cross. And I think my mum must have just been quiet, you know, that day and didn't really hear, or maybe, I don't know. But there is some perception for me that as we get older, into older years, that maybe we're just overlooked and not considered. And I can think in nursing homes, I wonder just how much people are asked permission before they're moved, you know, being people in a wheelchair, for instance. I remember taking a neighbour to a dentist appointment, and when I got her into the shop, and I very much remember thinking that all the questions from the receptionist were directed at me as her carer. And I thought, stuff this. So instead of looking at the receptionist, I started looking at the lady in the wheelchair, so that she couldn't talk to me. She had to talk to my friend. And I think well, maybe this generation, maybe our fiery, whatever label we've got on us, you know, the 60, 70-year-olds of this, maybe we are more vocal, maybe we have got more boundaries, maybe we are willing to put up with less. And also there's those stereotypical, those crotchety old women with a walking stick who just are really fiery and rude. And I don't know, there's somewhere in between those two, isn't there? You know, that, and I suppose if you don't get heard or listened to and you've had a lifetime of that, maybe you do get a bit pissed off towards your older years, and you're shaking your fist at everybody and saying, in my day, you know. So apologies to stereotyping somebody. But I guess we all know somebody who is a bit like that, you know, feisty, and people jump to attention when she comes into the shop or looks after her. You know, she's got that authority, and it might be power over, but at least she's got some authority and some sort of, she's not disappeared like so many, I think, older women tend to become invisible and not noticed, you know. So
what about you, Gwen?
Happen less, don't you? I think that's going to happen less.
I think so.
I think our generation have come out of the woodwork, if you like.
Yes.
And I've never really understood this thing. People say women over the age of 60 are invisible. I sort of think you're invisible if that's what you think about yourself. If you think you're not worth seeing, then you're invisible. And I think we all have the chance now to, I mean, you know, I'm wearing some pink dungarees today. My mum would have, I mean, she would have worn jeans in the garden, but, you know, she had her hair permed and because she was living in patterns of what was expected of her from the age of 50 or whatever onwards. So it was very trammeled, her life, in a way. And there were people who were, my aunt was a weaver. She was so she was an artist, and she was funky, you know, but she lived to 87 or something, and she was bloody difficult. You know, because she was such a character, and she wasn't going to be pushed around by anybody. Yeah. So I think I think our kids are going to have a tougher time.
Yeah, and I think that's true, Sally, about the invisible thing. I think it is a myth. I think it is a myth, though, that is quite perpetuated in our society of older women and older generation, and I don't think it's true at all. But I think you also can have a perception of being invisible at any age, and that is a belief that some of us, I certainly used to carrying around with me in my 20s and 30s, was very much invisible. Yes,
and now there's this imposter syndrome, which so many young people are struggling with, and middle-aged. And I think that's because they don't know themselves, and that's where, you know, the sort of stuff that some of us are doing in terms of know yourself, go within and get to know who you really are first is really important.
Just briefly, because I know you want to do a little exercise.
Yes, I do.
In relation to something that I've done recently, which was looking how I would want my death and dying to look, was to put very clear boundaries in place about what I would want, but also considering those that might be around me as well, and having the conversations about what might they be capable of, therefore negotiating the boundaries around how I see and how I want to plan it to ensure that I have the death that I want. So I have to be very clear about that. But as I say, I also have to, with my son or whoever it might be there, it's really important to include them in setting the boundaries. So sometimes we do have to negotiate boundaries as part of developing a relationship.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, Gwen. I think that we haven't talked about that a lot. I think you mentioned the word maybe earlier, and I was going to add to that, which is a yes, but, or a no, but. You know, I think when we start to have these conversations, you can't have these conversations if they're just in your head and you're just hiding from them. But once you start having the conversation, you can be noticing actually if it's not a full yes, or if it's not a full no, what is it in the middle? What is it? Can you notice that you want that would make it a yes for you? And this then becomes a real nuanced area of being able to negotiate and making it work for everyone. But, you know, yeah, making it work for everyone. Win-win, but yeah, but making sure everyone's boundaries is taken into account. And everyone is happy, because again, when we talk about relationships, it's often thought of as a compromise. We compromise in relationships, but actually a compromise is someone feeling is losing. And so, you know, I certainly know in a lot of my 2 long-term relationships and most of my other relationships felt like we're compromised. And that's, you know, not honoring my boundaries as well. So, sorry, I changed the subject a little bit there, Gwen. Did you finish off?
No, I finished. That was just what I wanted to say about, you know.
Brilliant. Well, we do only have about 6 or 7 minutes left. So as Gwen said, I was hoping to do a little exercise. We haven't done this before on one of these Zoom lives, but I'm really, me and Gwen were talking about this and I'm really keen to support people in actually having something practical to take away with them. So what I was going to do is just something really simple. I'm going to throw, and I haven't told you about this exercise, so so sorry, there's no consent here.
This sounds like something I would do.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier, Sunday, practicing not doing it sometimes as well. So yeah, feel free to not join in if it doesn't feel right for you. Is a consent-ish conversation. But what I'm going to explore really is the yes and no's piece we touched on earlier. Very often there's 2 aspects to consent, and I think we've touched on it. One is, do we know our own yeses and nos? Do we know what we want and what we don't want? So very often people who come to me, and maybe you've experienced this, Sally, with people you work with, is they very often don't know what they want. So noticing where is a yes and where is a no is something I would start with. And then also voicing it is that second step. But very often people can't voice it because they don't actually know what they want. So we're just going to start off with some quick exercise. I'm going to throw out some questions, some request statements. And I want you to take a notice of your body and notice what you're feeling is the response. Where do you notice it in your body? And what would the response be? So we'll have I'll do one question and we'll take some quick sharing and we'll try a different question. I'm gonna ask,
and those who are watching can do it at home.
Yes, they can do it at home. That's the point of this.
So I'm not on my own in this. Me and Sally and Gwen are on our own. Join in at home.
Join in at home. You're allowed to join in at home with us. So I'm going to throw out some statements, and really, again, I think Sally touched on this earlier, not responding straight away, but just sitting with, noticing quietly, what is it your body is saying to you? So I'll ask the question, we'll spend about 30 seconds or so in quietness, I might ask you to notice what you're feeling in your body, and then I'll bring it to a close, and then we can share what we noticed. So I request you take all your clothes off and run around the street naked.
Oh.
Notice your body responses. Where are you feeling the responses? What feelings and sensations are there? What is the answer? It may be a full yes, it may be a full no, it might be a maybe, but I would like it done this way instead of that way.
I felt it all here.
Yes, all there.
It was all here. It was an excitement.
Yeah,
And it was, oh, I'd love to do that.
I knew you would.
And
Yeah,
then,
we said this the other day. We said,
but then what came up after that was all the conditions.
uh-huh.
Tonight, when it's dark and there's nobody
Well, do you know what I thought?
have a shawl to wash around me just in case. You know, so you go, ooh, and then
My reaction was similar to yours. It was dead excited, and then I could feel it in my yoni as well. And then I thought, oh, but I'm only doing it when Sunday's here.
We're all going to have to do a trip together, aren't we? Something to do. Sally, what about you?
There's no effing way.
And where did you feel that in your body? In your throat.
Yeah, in my throat. Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. So that was a very strong no there from Sally. That was conditions from Gwen and Sunday. And it's great. It sounded like you knew what your conditions would be as well. Was that correct? I won't go necessarily into them because we've only got a minute left, a couple of minutes.
yeah.
Brilliant. I'm going to do one last question. So I request you go and take a hot bath for about 2 hours and put the candles on and get some massage oil out and spend 2 hours in the bath looking after yourself. Just taking a moment, where is that in your body? What is the answer? When you're noticing. And anyone like to share that?
Yeah, I'm a no.
You would know. Hey.
Too long in the bath.
Too long.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Is that because I was thinking that because I put that 2 hours in there and put on purpose. Is it because you think you don't have enough time, or is that a true?
No, it's just too long.
authentic-
Pruny and
Pruny.
cold water and.
So would it have been a yes if I'd have said an hour or 40 minutes? Or?
Possibly, yeah. So yeah, 20 minutes on my own, like, and then I can give you a long list of all the massage oil things and how I want it all set up. Yeah, let me help you create this for me if this is what you're giving me. Yes, very much so. Hot towels, warm towels to wrap me in. Come wrap me in them. So I could give you a full list of.
Beautiful. What about you, Gwen?
I felt it in my tummy. I felt a real softening, but 2 hours are too long for me. I thought, oh, I'd never stick it that long. And like Sunday, the water get cold. But like Sunday as well, I thought, but if I got out of the bath and there was somebody there to do different things for me, and maybe, yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gwen. What about you, Sally?
2 hours is too long. The first thing I thought was I'm wrinkly enough as it is without 2 hours of hot water. And it's hot today, so it doesn't feel like a good idea. If it was a cold winter's day, it might appeal more. So then I started to sort of create the boundaries for myself around how I could do that, because but I often think it's a nice idea, and then I go and get in the bath, and then 10, 15, 20 minutes later, I'm bored.
Yeah.
Yes, I've got something good to listen to.
Yeah, beautiful. And where did you feel that in your body, Sally?
Oh, just over my shoulders, and my neck.
That's beautiful. What I loved about everything you said was really noticing what you needed to make that work for you and be able to ask for that. So knowing that, then the second part would be to ask for that from whoever's offering that or giving it to you or whatever. Anyway, we're a couple of minutes over, so we need to wrap it up.
Yay.
But hopefully for the viewers of watching this, that was useful. And it's the start of a whole world of noticing your boundaries and being able to ask for what you want. So
yeah, thank you, Melanie.
You're welcome.
Gwen.
Thank you as all. I'm going to stop the live thing.